Live from Washington, I'm Aisha Tanzim and you're watching Access Point. Hello and welcome. Despite the violence that has killed thousands of Pakistanis, the country's legitimate political parties continue to associate with extremist groups. Why? And what may change this behavior? Harun Allah's book, Vying for Allah's Vote, answers these questions. He's a staff advisor to the U.S. State Department and was a member of the late Ambassador Richard Holbrooke's policy team on Afghanistan and Pakistan. Today he joins us here to discuss these extremely important issues. Harun, welcome to Access Point.
It's an honor to be here, and happy 4th of July to you and the whole team.
Happy 4th of July to you. You have two books. I read this one with the bargain from the bazaar. I'm looking forward to read. I have a copy, but we'll talk about that later. First, for this book, you observe in your book that Pakistan's religious political parties are less ideological than we think. Were you surprised by these findings?
Yeah, you know, I came in thinking that these parties are driven by strict ideological mandates. And what I found actually is that they have sort of surprising flexibility. They're like any other political party. They want to maximize the number of votes that they get. And so you can look at where they take a position based on they want a seat at the table, like any other political party. They are sort of power hungry. They're political entrepreneurs. And so that explained a little bit about what drives these parties.
Okay, and what you explain in the book is that these parties can move left if it serves their political purpose just as easily as they can move right. Then the question is, if that's the case, then why does it seem like Pakistan overall is moving to the right?
Yeah, that's a great question, Aisha. You know, in the literature on political parties, and when people look at Pakistan, they assume that if you're competing in election after election, you'll naturally move towards the middle. It makes sense. If we're competing and political parties are competing in an election, they're going to move towards the center. But what we find in Pakistan is that, as you noted, some parties will equally move to the right, some parties will equally move to the left. That flexibility, that democracy doesn't always lead to moderation. And I think that's surprising for many because we assume that when you have democracy in elections, after election, you're going to move towards the middle. And Pakistan's Islamist parties provide a useful antidote to that because they don't move always to the center. In fact, sometimes they do become more extreme depending on the specific issue.
But then we see that it's not just the religious parties, it's mainstream political parties that are moving to the right. We see PTI, this new player in the game, coming in and trying to be more right than the right.
Yeah.
We see PMLN on some issues slightly left, but on a lot of issues, a lot of rhetoric going towards the right. We don't see the leftist parties being as left as before. Why?
Well, I think what you find actually is you're exactly right. But there's a reason why that's happening because I think Imran Khan has made a strategic decision and the PTI that by aligning themselves in a center-right coalition, they're going to be able to maximize the number of votes and build their bases, especially in the northern areas and in certain parts of Punjab. And so if you look at electoral by district, you'll find that's why they're sharing power in the northern province, because they have made that decision that taking those issues are popular. It allows them to, motivate their base and sort of harbor or push back any sort of backlash they might face. And so I think there's a reason why those political parties are doing those things.
And Imran Khan's politics is very interesting. A lot of people want to know, when Imran Khan, especially during the last elections, we had the whole left open. People's Party, which is supposed to be the representative of the left, ANP, which is supposed to be a secular party. People were very disgruntled with that. Nawaz Sharif was a viable opposition, so Imran goes head-to-head with Sharif, going for the vote on the right, while leaving the whole left field open.
Yeah.
Why?
That's a great question. I think a lot of people wonder that. My own sense is, and what I talk about in the book, in Vying for Allah's Vote, is that, it fits with his own personal narrative. I think Imran Khan felt that he had been always lauded as this sort of guy that was spending too much time in England, Oxford educated, he was a playboy. People sort of assumed that he was a celebrity but wouldn't take him seriously. And so I think his own personal narrative was that he wanted to reform, focus on the hospitals and his charity work, but really sort of he moved center-right because I think he strategically thought that's a way he can reform his own image. He can say, look, I was young doing those things in my younger years. Here's now, I'm on this path now. now I've realized what Pakistan's all about. Here's what I believe. And so you see him moving to the right, again, strategically, because it's a way to protect any sort of criticism about his past.
But why does he need to do that when a lot of times he claims that his base is the educated, urban elite? A lot of times people who've gone back from America and Canada, who've lived abroad, those people wanted, they were motivated by his talk on corruption and the lack of corruption. Every time you talk to an Imran Khan supporter, they're talking about corruption and good governance. They're not talking about religion. So why do you think he felt that need?
That's a great point, Aisha. Well, here's the interesting thing. His support actually is coming from the thin middle class. So he is drawing from the thin middle class because the thin middle class is on the fence. In Pakistan, the thin middle class is anywhere between sort of 8 and 12%. They make up the swing vote in elections. This is urban-based, oftentimes university educated. These are people that make between 20,000 and 100,000 rupees a month. And so oftentimes they're technocrats. They're people that don't have skills that can be exported abroad. They're lawyers because you can't practice abroad. And so he's right in the sense that he is appealing to that thin middle class because that is the same population that's also getting drawn into some of these extremist groups and that may be more sympathetic to that center-right kind of narrative.
So a very interesting new player on the Pakistani arena, Tahir al-Qadri. Where do you put him on this, what in your book you describe, the Sharia secular continuum?
Absolutely. Well, in my book, I sort of put Tahir al-Qadri as, I think, a phenomena of, again, a center-right. He's a religious political entrepreneur. And he's somebody that really is agitating. He has the religious credibility. He's a key influencer, especially in Punjab. He's able to, with Minhaj, his organization, Minhaj al-Quran, he's able to really motivate people, get them out on the streets. I was in Pakistan when he had first returned, and they had the huge rallies in Islamabad and all over the country. And so I think what Tahir al-Qadri has done is he is sort of billing himself as an opposition to the government, but as somebody who's center-right, who's a religious entrepreneur, able to mobilize the key influencers, as I think of the sort of Billy Grahams of Pakistan. And he's able to get them out, get them agitated, get them on the streets.
So here's the question, though. We all know that more than 50,000 Pakistanis have died in the last 10 years, most of it due to violence by extremist groups. And yet we see a lot of our political parties, sometimes mainstream, sometimes religious parties, associating with these extremist groups. There were reports of well-known political leaders traveling in the same cars, going to jalsas with some of these well-known extremists. Wouldn't the Pakistani public be against it? I mean, why is it politically helpful?
Well, that's a great question, Aisha. And I think that's something I talk about in the book, is that a lot of political parties, and especially Islamic parties, even the mainstream Islamic parties, they leverage their connections to extremist groups to push their political agenda. And they leverage it is because these extremist groups have a monopoly on violence. And so that in a lot of ways, especially in southern Punjab, if you look at electoral districts, political parties were saying, look, if you vote for us, you'll also get our security. Because security is one of the primary determinants of how people vote. They're scared. Security is a big thing for your family, for your extended family. And so what these groups were saying is that if you don't vote for us, you're not going to get our security, i.e. you might bear the cost of the violence. And so I think in a lot of ways they were using those connections. It's very strategic because the violence happens in certain places for certain reasons.
So basically what they're saying is if you vote for us, this group will not attack you or your village or your town.
That's right. And you can actually, if you map a political geography of where the attacks are happening onto the electoral districts, you'll find that violence is happening in specific electoral districts for very specific reasons. And so they're aimed at targeted constituencies.
Why is it then that during the last election, the extremist groups, particularly named three political parties, MQM, ANP, and PPP as targets, but not the others, not PMLN, not PTI?
Because those groups are seen as sort of center-left. And they're seen as not part of the coalition of what they think of as the larger political parties, Islamic parties, or those that use religion to motivate, to mobilize, to attract awareness. And so I think those parties were labeled as they're against the Pakistani national mandate, and that, ANP especially took very, very heavy losses, both in terms of candidates and in terms of attacks on their headquarters, on party offices. I was in Pakistan during that time. It was very, very tragic to see.
Where would you put military in this mix?
Yeah, I think that the Pakistan military is still the strongest political institution in Pakistan. I mean, they still have the strongest hierarchy network. I think they're important, absolutely important, integral part of the landscape in the civil-military relations. And I would say that they oftentimes are playing sort of behind-the-scenes role, very similar to what you see in Turkey with the National Security Council there. I think there's a model of what Turkey has done. You find the same thing that Pakistan military is following.
And a lot of these extremist groups allegedly have support from the military. So, and the military is using them for their strategic purposes. But how much is it influencing the politics? How many decisions are being made behind the scenes by the military, in your opinion?
I mean, the military is still very strong. There's no doubt that a lot of the major decisions still go through the military in Pakistan. It's the strongest institution. It has the, in terms of look at the mobilization, the support in certain areas. But I think what's important here is that this election was watershed last year. It was the first time you had a democratic changeover in Pakistan's history. And I was there. I was an election observer, and I was amazed at the numbers of young people, older people, women that had never voted before. I saw lines going, and I've been in Pakistan for 6 elections. I'd never seen that kind of turnout. It was the highest turnout in Pakistan history. So I do think that this political equation, political parties, really sort of have a new sort of platform for the future.
Another thing that you observe in your book is that the Islamists or the Islamic parties, the perception is that they're more ideological, and the more mainstream parties, some of which you call Muslim Democrats,
yeah.
And I'm assuming that PTI and PMLN and PMLQ will all fall under that umbrella,
That's right.
Whereas ANP, PPP, and MQM will fall under more secular parties. So the assumption is that the Islamic parties are more ideological, whereas Muslim Democrats are more pragmatic. You don't agree?
Well, I think that when I look at the political landscape, I do look at that these Muslim Democrats are the real key. If you want to think about moderating this sort of phenomena of leveraging extremist groups, Muslim Democrats, similar to what you find in Turkey and Malaysia, they're the key because they have to build coalitions with these center-right parties, the Jamaat, Jamiat Ulama Islam, JUI, and some of these far-right parties, because these Muslim Democrats have legitimacy within the same base of voters. And so it's key for them to reach out and build consensus, and that is what will lead to moderating influence in Pakistani landscape.
So you're suggesting that all the support for the ideology of extremist groups and the extremist groups themselves is to gain political power, political votes. Before I go into how does one stop that, you also mentioned something about the Islamic parties being more active at the local level, whereas the Muslim Democrats more at the national level. Why do you think is there a distinction between the two?
Yeah, that's a great point, Aisha. What you find with the Islamists is that they're able to use the mosques, houses of worship in local areas, the local political, religious leaders that are giving the Friday sermons. They're able to use that to mobilize people, especially on Fridays, like today. They're able to get people out on the streets. And so in a local electoral at the Tehsil level, they're able to better sort of mobilize awareness around their specific religious political leader. On the national level, it's much harder. You have to have a real grassroots, almost like we think of here in the U.S., Chicago machine politics. You have to have a much bigger organization that could really get the vote out. They're not there yet.
Okay, so if they're active on the local level, and we've observed particularly with Jamaat Islami, every time it comes into power in any province, it wants the education portfolio. Obviously, because education is where you groom the next generation, you mold minds, etc. So they have slowly moved the whole society to the left because the liberals don't seem to be concerned with education. Mm-hmm. They're more at the national level. They say they care about education, but people say they don't as much as they should. The whole society is kind of sliding to the right. How does one stop that slide?
That's a great point. I think it's mixed. I mean, you do find parts of the younger generation, and this is young, 60% of the population in Pakistan under the age of 30, huge demographic bulge. I would say that they're in the middle somewhere. They're confused. On some parts, the young generation are very liberal in terms of their cultural norms and the types of media that they're, the movies, the Turkish dramas, and everything that they're sort of in, the Renaissance you find. The Lahore Literary Festival a few months ago, 50,000 people in 4 days. On other issues, you find that there's sometimes sympathy. I talk about in the book about Salman Taseer, the tragedy of, I was a block away when he got gunned down there in Islamabad in 2011. And I remember meeting with other families, and one family in particular that I had gotten to know, and they would tell me the story that their oldest son came home, and after discussing it over dinner, their oldest son, who had the best education, who had, they had sort of given him everything, said, "Dad, I think Salman Taseer deserved to die." And so, they were shocked. But you find a lot of young people that are a little ambivalent. They say, well, the Taliban are bad, but, we see this violence, but. And so they're, I think, on the fence. And so I think it's a bit of a mixed bag. And, the Jamaat is focusing on education because they want to influence public school systems.
And this mixed bag that you say, people are confused. They want to give rights to minorities, but they're not going to really go out and stand up for those rights. They want to oppose the violence, but why do you think there's so much confusion? Is it because there's so many messages coming from all sides? Is it because Pakistan feels like it's the victim of some conspiracies, as a lot of Pakistanis seems to think?
Yeah, no, I mean, that might be part of it. I think part of it is that also the media, 90-plus channels. You have 110 million people tuning into TV. And every night between 7 and 10 p.m., and hopefully people that watch your show, 40 million people tune in prime time. And so I think that you find a lot of different messages out there. Young people are watching the dramas, the documentaries. They're sort of taking all of this in. And you see that sometimes they get mixed messages on the narratives, whether it's in the news or whether the reporting on some of these suicide bombings or the violence in the north. And so I think that influences them. They see a lot of the violence and they think, wait, this violence maybe should be blamed on an external actor. Or maybe this violence is not endemic to Pakistan. Maybe it's not our fault. Maybe Lashkar-e-Taiba is not so bad. They see maybe reporting that Lashkar-e-Taiba and Jamaat-e-Dawa are giving out, for example, in the current IDP crisis.
Their camps are there.
And they're giving them out, they're giving things to refugees, and people think, maybe they're not so bad. And so I think a lot of this influences the permissive environment around extremism in Pakistan. And what we need is we need more people, the key influencers, who are courageous to stand up and oftentimes denounce what some of the extremist groups are doing.
Here's a question, though. So on a lot of things, PMLN caters to the right. It's rhetoric. We see how they react to events. And then on one key event, India, they've moved totally against what all the religious parties in Pakistan say. Some say even against what the military wants. What drove them on that one issue? What drove Nawaz Sharif to move more towards moderation?
Well, I think the big thing, and which was a great gesture by both sides, by Prime Minister Modi as well as Prime Minister Sharif, after the election, I think what drives it is the economics and the potential for trade. I think at the end of the day, Sharif, being somebody who's really builds himself as somebody of economic reform, realizes the upside and the potential. And if you look at the statistics and the data, you find that Pakistan actually would enjoy more benefits if trade opened up with India. They really would there's a lot of upside. So I think that part of the reaching out is that they realize that their commercial base of entrepreneurs that are a big part of PMLN, especially in Punjab, would really benefit if there was an opening up with India.
Okay, so you also say, let's talk about some of the solutions, because Pakistan is going through the worst kind of violence. People are scared. Life has changed. You see big barriers everywhere. It's not the country that I grew up in. When I go back, it's a different country. You say, given the right incentives, parties can move to the left.
Absolutely.
What incentives would that be?
So part of it rests with the Muslim Democrats, in terms of building consensus. I still have hope that the PMLNs, the PTIs, PMLQs, that these parties will build consensus with some of the far-right parties. We have to remember that the far-right parties in national polling have never got more than, let's say, 10% of the vote. And so even for all their popularity, they still don't have a large cross-section. They're influential because they control a lot of the swing vote. So I'm still hopeful that the Muslim Democrats can really influence some of these parties. And I also think back historically that, yes, the last 20, 30 years have been difficult. You see a lot of ups and downs. But when I talk to Pakistanis, and as I lived in Pakistan for almost 8 years, I also met Pakistanis that remember Jackie Kennedy, going down an open motorcade in Lahore. They remember President Eisenhower watching a cricket match. They remember President Nixon on the back of a truck. And so I am cautiously optimistic. I meet enough young people, the Malalas of the world, hundreds of Malalas I've met that are doing inspiring work beyond all the obstacles and odds. And so I'm hopeful that this generation that grows up, that is searching for their identity, will move Pakistan in a positive direction.
You talk, and your book actually is essentially policy recommendations to the West. So I'm just wondering, out of curiosity, whether, now that you're part of state, what kind of reviews did you get on the book? From your peers, from your bosses, from the decision makers at state?
That's a great question.
Are they looking at it and saying, oh, yeah, this is what we should do?
Well, I've been very fortunate. I mean, this was a group effort. I mean, I was heartened to work with some of the best scholars, both in Pakistan and here. I had great mentors like the late Ambassador Holbrooke, who I did inspiring work. I was also very lucky, my former ambassador I worked for, Cameron Munter, helped write a very nice blurb. Vali Nasser, another one, somebody who I look up to and worked with very closely, was also very kind. My idea was we have to be realistic. This is too important to ignore. Pakistan's too important to ignore. We've seen this movie before when we do ignore Pakistan. And one of the big recommendations in here was this idea of looking at faith-based engagement. It's one of the hallmarks of of what we currently do in many other countries, of our interfaith engagement. Because I think, religious leaders in Pakistan, we have to think about how do we engage with them. And not just religious leaders, but women religious leaders. Because there's these huge Al-Huda society, Jamaat Islami has a women's wing, that this is sort of a black hole on our engagement. We have to think about how do we strategically meet with some of these religious leaders to work on these issues.
So what does U.S. do now? Just ignore them? Pretend they don't exist?
It's not that we ignore them. That oftentimes, in a country of 180 million plus, we focused on meeting with certain groups based on where we can meet with them. My idea was we need to start meeting more with middle-class youth, public universities, right? Like Punjab University.
I mean, you even make a recommendation that high-ranking U.S. officials go hang out at madrasas.
Well, I think it's important for us to engage with those key influencers because, interestingly enough, a lot of the religious schools are also bearing the cost of the violence. They're saying, wait a minute, we're bearing the cost of the Taliban attacking us. They're taking away all of our students. And for religious schools, students equals money. And so as they have incentives now to say, hey, we want to bring English language, and we do. We have English language access programs in 4 to 5 religious schools in Pakistan. I think that there potentially is some synergy in interfaith, teaching building leadership. I've seen with my own eyes where if religious leaders go through the interfaith training, get that experience. They're holding Christmas celebrations in their mosques. They're doing things with the Jewish communities. I mean, things that we oftentimes thought were not possible because, again, they are bearing the cost of violence. They also realize, wait a minute, those guys, those Taliban, those extremists, it's not worth it.
You say something very interesting in your book. You say not only should the U.S. and other Western countries engage with them, they should let them design the local marketing strategies for any aid programs, any awareness or education programs that are funded by the West, including even denouncing the West, bad-mouthing the West. Why would you say that?
Well, what I say actually is a little different. So what I said actually is that we have to engage with them to think about when we message in a place like Pakistan, it has to be about anti-violence. The goal of our messaging in a place like Pakistan should be criminalizing insurgency groups. We have to criminalize those extremist groups, criminalize their actions, show their hypocrisy. We have to because a lot of young people, a lot of my research that went into this was going into terrorist camps. I did my doctoral work in Pakistan, and I spent years before joining the State Department living there, interviewing young people to say, why do they join the Taliban? Why do they join Al-Qaeda? And that's what undergirded the book was, we have to focus on criminalizing insurgency groups, amplifying authentic voices in Pakistan to fight against those extremists.
And that includes giving aid to those who are usually, who have anti-Western rhetoric.
Well, we have to think carefully about what we use as a litmus test in a place like Pakistan. Not everybody's going to like us. And our goal in Pakistan is not a popularity contest because anti-Americanism actually doesn't correlate to protecting the U.S. What correlates to protecting the U.S. is reducing recruitment, reducing these recruits that want to attack the U.S. and our interests. And that should be our goal, which I think it is really thinking about how do we help Pakistanis on the front line reduce extremism, this homegrown problem.
And you also say that when it comes to implementing Western policies, or at least Western way of thinking, U.S. and others should not look towards the secular parties. The Muslim Democrats are a more viable choice. Why?
Well, my goal is that we have to work with everyone. We have to work with everybody along the political landscape, but that we have to also think particularly about Muslim Democrats, because Muslim Democrats have this unique way to rein in and consensus building with the far right. And if they can rein in the far right, we will see recruitment going down. Our goal, again, in Pakistan is criminalize insurgency groups so that recruitment goes down. And data shows in Pakistan is that as the Taliban and Lashkar-e-Taiba, Lashkar-e-Jhangvi, as their popularity goes down among the public, recruitment goes down.
And you think parties like PTI and PMLN can do it more easily than, let's say, PPP and ANP?
Absolutely, because they're trying to attract the same set of voters. Oftentimes it's PTI. Why you see Imran Khan saying things to the far right? Because he's trying to attract the same voter base in those key electoral districts. So that is where the real crux of the fight is. And that's why I think Muslim Democrats are such an important part, like what we see in Turkey with Erdogan and AKP, like what we see in Malaysia and other places. Muslim Democrats are a key piece of this puzzle.
Okay, well, we were talking about Vying for Allah's Vote, which I really enjoyed reading. You have another book. You have a copy of it here.
I do, right here.
Oh, wonderful. I may have you sign it before you leave,
Absolutely.
But I haven't read it. I'm looking forward to reading it. Tell me what's in this book.
So Bargain from the Bazaar. Bargain from the Bazaar is part of my work with a family I met in 2004. You know, and Aisha, I grew up in small town America. So I grew up in a very small rural part on the western side of the United States. And this is my journey back to Pakistan. I met this middle-class family, and this middle-class family taught me about a different side of Pakistan that I didn't see. You know, where I grew up in a small town, people said, oh, Pakistan's like the Soviet Union. It's a black hole, most dangerous place in the world. We don't understand what they're doing. And when I went to Pakistan, I met middle-class families like this family I met in 2004, and they taught me about resilience and triumph. They showed me a different side of Pakistan. Pakistanis that don't get reported on, they're not part of the elites, they're just trying to get by day to day. And it really changed my life, you know, meeting them, spending time with them. I spent 8 years with them. And, you know, and I think it changes other people, you know, when they learn about this family.
So does that experience helps you while you're working at State?
Absolutely. I mean, it helps, I think, give me a well-rounded picture, because part of my recommendations in Vying for Allah's Vote is that we need to engage with middle-class Pakistanis, the thin middle class. We have to think about programs. That is the key demographic, because it's middle-class Pakistanis that are the swing vote. They're really key. They're invested in Pakistan. And so we have to think more carefully about doing programs in urban areas, reaching out to them in educational programs, people-to-people exchanges, things that we're doing, but I think we could do even more of.
Okay. So again, coming back to a question I asked you earlier, do you think your recommendations were taken seriously by State Department?
I hope so. I think they are. I think so. And I think you see right now State Department really focusing in on building the U.S.-Pakistan relations. It's continuing to strengthen. You see a lot of heartening sort of trends in those relations. It was a bumpy ride for a few years, but really, I think Secretary Kerry's done a great job under his leadership, under Jim Dobbins as a special representative, of trying to really focus in on the strategic dialogue and building those relations.
Well, thank you so much, Haroon. It was such a pleasure to have you. I'm looking forward to reading your second book. I enjoyed reading the first. Your recommendations were interesting, new, but maybe they'll work. Something needs to work in Pakistan. Well, that's it for our show today. I want to thank Haroon Ullah for joining us, author of Vying for Allah's Vote and The Bargain from the Bazaar. And thank you for joining us. We look forward to your questions, your comments, your ideas for future shows on our website, on our Facebook page, and you can follow us on Twitter. Goodbye.